The drone crashed into the wedding ceremony at exactly 3:47 p.m., sending the bride's cake flying into the horrified faces of 200 guests. Amara Nyong'o watched from her penthouse office as her latest delivery prototype turned Tanzania's most expensive wedding into a disaster zone, live-streamed across social media for the world to see. Her phone exploded with notifications. The Minister of Transportation was calling. The Tourism Board was calling. Her investors were calling. But Amara couldn't move. She stood frozen behind floor-to-ceiling windows, watching emergency crews swarm the Serena Hotel's garden below, knowing that everything she'd built over the past 5 years was crashing down with that drone. "Ma'am, we have a problem." Marcus, her chief technology officer, burst through the office doors without knocking. His usually pristine suit was wrinkled, sweat beading on his dark forehead. "That's the 7th crash this month. The government is threatening to shut us down." Amara finally turned from the window, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. At 32, she was East Africa's youngest female billionaire, having built Swift Deliver from a small Nairobi startup into a continental logistics empire. Her drones were supposed to revolutionize delivery across Africa. Instead, they were becoming flying disasters. "What's the damage report?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. Marcus pulled up holographic displays from his tablet. "The bride is demanding 50 million shillings in compensation. The hotel is threatening to sue. And worse," he paused, his fingers trembling. "The minister just called. If we have one more incident, they're revoking our flight licenses permanently." Amara's stomach dropped. Without flight licenses, Swift Deliver was worthless. Her company employed 12,000 people across 6 countries. Her net worth of $2.8 billion was tied up in drone technology patents and infrastructure. One more crash would destroy everything. "How did this happen?" she demanded. "Our AI navigation system is the most advanced in the world. We've mapped every building, every tree, every power line in Dar es Salaam." Marcus hesitated. "That's just it, ma'am. Our drones navigate perfectly around physical obstacles, but they keep crashing into things that aren't on any map." "What do you mean?" Today's wedding wasn't scheduled in any official system. The taxi drivers somehow knew about the ceremony and were routing around the garden all morning. The matatu drivers knew. Even street vendors had moved their stalls. But our drones had no idea. Amara felt a chill run down her spine. "You're saying there's an invisible network that our technology can't see?" Before Marcus could answer, her assistant rushed in. "Ma'am, there's someone downstairs demanding to speak with you. Security tried to remove him, but he says he knows why your drones keep crashing. He says he can fix it." Amara laughed bitterly. "Let me guess. Another consultant trying to make a quick buck off our problems." "Actually, ma'am." Her assistant looked uncomfortable. "He's homeless. Been living on the streets for months. But he knew about today's crash before it happened. He was standing outside our building when the drone went down, just nodding like he expected it." The room fell silent. Amara's mind raced. Her company was bleeding money, losing contracts, facing government shutdown. She tried everything, hiring the best engineers from MIT, upgrading her AI systems, partnering with Google's mapping division. Nothing worked. What did she have to lose? "Bring him up," she said quietly. Marcus stepped forward. "Ma'am, with all due respect, a homeless man can't solve problems that our PhD engineers can't. Our PhD engineers just crashed a drone into a wedding cake," Amara snapped. "Maybe it's time to listen to someone else." 10 minutes later, the elevator doors opened, revealing a man who looked like he'd been living rough for months. His clothes were patched and faded, his hair overgrown, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He walked into her billion-dollar office like he belonged there. "Ms. Nyong'o," he said in perfect English, then switched to fluid Swahili, then what sounded like Kikuyu. "I've been watching your drones fail for months. I know why they crash." Amara studied him carefully. "And you are?" "Joseph Mwangi, former network engineer, current observer of how this city actually works." He smiled sadly. "Your drones are blind to the real Dar es Salaam." "Explain." Joseph walked to her window, pointing down at the bustling streets. "Your computers see buildings and roads, but they can't see the conversation. What conversation? The one that told every taxi driver to avoid the hotel garden today. The one that warned street vendors about the police raid on Kariako Market yesterday. The one that reroutes traffic when someone's grandmother dies and a funeral procession needs to pass through. He turned back to her. Your drones crash because they're flying through a city they can't hear. Amara felt her world shifting. You're saying there's a communication network we don't know about? 7 of them, actually. Each tribal community has its own information flow. They overlap, intersect, share critical data. Your drones navigate the physical city perfectly, but they're flying blind through the social city. The implications hit her like a thunderbolt. Her technology was worthless if it couldn't integrate with how people actually lived and communicated in Africa. If you understand these networks, she said slowly, why are you homeless? Joseph's face hardened. Because understanding the conversation and being welcome in it are 2 different things. I made some mistakes, lost some trust, but I can still hear what the city is saying. Amara's phone buzzed with an urgent message from her board of directors. Emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Vote of no confidence being called. She looked at this strange man who claimed to understand what her billion-dollar technology missed. Her company was on the verge of collapse. Her reputation was in ruins. Her investors were abandoning ship. If you can fix this, she said quietly, I'll make you rich. Joseph shook his head. I don't want money, Ms. Nyong'o. I want redemption. Before she could ask what he meant, Marcus burst in again, his face pale with panic. Ma'am, we just lost our biggest client. The government contract for medical deliveries. They've canceled everything. We have 72 hours to prove our system works, or they're shutting us down permanently. Amara turned back to Joseph, but he was already walking toward the elevator. Wait, she called. Where are you going? He paused at the elevator doors. To show you how to listen to a city of 7 million voices. But first, you need to understand why I'm the only person who can save your company. The elevator doors closed, leaving Amara alone with Marcus and a terrible realization. Her entire empire depended on a homeless man she'd just met, and she didn't even know his real story. Billionaire's empire crashing down. What happens when a homeless man holds the key to saving a $2.8 billion drone company? Smash that like if you think Amara should trust Joseph. And subscribe for the most shocking corporate warfare story you've ever heard. Comment below. Would you trust a stranger with your billion-dollar business? The next morning, Amara found Joseph exactly where he'd said he'd be. Sitting on the steps of the Central Post Office, speaking quietly with 3 different groups of people in 3 different languages. She watched from her car as Matata drivers stopped to shake his hand, street vendors brought him tea, and even uniformed police officers nodded respectfully as they passed. For someone who claimed to have lost trust, he seemed surprisingly connected. Ms. Nyong'o, he greeted her without looking up as she approached. Right on time. We have exactly 68 hours to save your company. About last night, she began. You said you wanted redemption. What did you mean? Joseph stood slowly, favoring his left leg. Walk with me. I need to show you something. They moved through the crowded streets, Joseph greeting people in different languages, Swahili with the bus drivers, Kikuyu with a group of mechanics, what sounded like Maasai with 2 women selling beaded jewelry. Each conversation seemed casual, but Amara noticed information flowing, warnings about police checkpoints, news about which roads were flooded, updates about market prices. This is how information really moves in Dar es Salaam, Joseph explained as they walked. Not through your internet or social media, through human networks that have existed for generations. They stopped at a small electronics repair shop where an elderly man was fixing old phones. Joseph spoke to him in rapid Swahili, and the man's face lit up with recognition. Mzee Rashidi, meet Amara Nyong'o, Joseph said in English. Mzee was one of the first telephone operators in Tanzania. He understands connectivity better than anyone. The old man studied Amara carefully. You're the drone lady, the one whose machines keep falling from the sky. Amara felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm trying to fix that problem. Your problem isn't technical, Mzee Rashidi said gently. Your problem is trust. In Africa, information flows through relationships. Your drones are strangers trying to navigate a family conversation. Joseph nodded. That's why I brought you here. Mz, tell her about the network. The old man set down his tools and looked directly at Amara. Every community in this city has information keepers. People who know when weddings happen, when funerals block roads, when political rallies will cause traffic jams. They share this knowledge through channels your computers can't access. But surely some of this information is online, Amara protested. Social media, event pages, official announcements. Maybe 20%, Joseph said. The other 80% travels through what we call the EuroTech network, community-based information sharing. It's faster than your internet and more accurate than your GPS. A young boy ran up to Mz Rashidi, speaking quickly in Swahili. The old man nodded, then turned to Joseph. There's going to be a protest at the Indian Ocean Road intersection in 2 hours. Traffic will be completely blocked. The taxi drivers are already rerouting. Joseph pulled out a battered smartphone and checked something. Your drone delivery to that area is scheduled for 2 p.m. It'll fly right into a crowd of protesters. Amara's blood went cold. Another disaster would end everything. How did you know about my delivery schedule? I didn't, but Mz did. News travels in this city, Ms. Nyong'o. You just have to know how to listen. She quickly called Marcus, ordering him to cancel the Indian Ocean Road delivery. As she hung up, she realized these two men had just prevented another catastrophic crash using nothing but human conversation. You said you wanted redemption, she said to Joseph. What happened to you? Joseph's expression darkened. I used to work for Vodacom Tanzania, network infrastructure engineer. I was building cell towers, expanding internet access, trying to modernize communication across East Africa. That sounds like important work. It was, until I made the same mistake you're making now. I thought technology could replace human networks instead of working with them. They started walking again, moving deeper into the narrow streets of the old city. The crowds grew thicker, the sounds more intense. Vendors calling out prices, children playing, music blending from different radios. I convinced Vodacom to build a major cell tower in a village outside Moshi, Joseph continued. The location was perfect from an engineering perspective. High elevation, central positioning, clear transmission lines. But I didn't consult with the community leaders. Amara began to sense where this story was heading. The tower was built on sacred ground, land that the Chaga people considered home to their ancestors. When they protested, I dismissed their concerns as superstition. I had surveys, environmental impact studies, government permits. I thought that was enough. What happened? The community sabotaged the tower, cut the power lines, damaged the equipment, made it impossible to operate. Vodacom lost millions of shillings. I lost my job. But worse than that, I lost my reputation. They stopped at a small cafe where Joseph ordered chai for both of them. The owner, a middle-aged woman with intricate braids, greeted Joseph warmly but looked suspiciously at Amara. Word travels fast in African communities, Joseph explained after they sat down. When you disrespect one community, others hear about it. I became known as the engineer who ignored local wisdom. No company would hire me. No community would trust me. So you ended up on the streets. For 8 months now. But homelessness taught me something that engineering school never could. I learned to listen instead of talking, to observe instead of assuming, to understand how information really flows between people. Amara sipped her tea, processing this revelation. And now you think you can help me avoid the same mistake. I know I can, because your drones aren't just crashing into physical obstacles. They're crashing into centuries of human communication patterns that your algorithms can't see. Joseph's phone buzzed. He answered in Swahili, his face growing tense as he listened. When he hung up, his expression was grim. We have a bigger problem than I thought, he said quietly. What now? That wasn't just random information about a protest. Someone called specifically to warn me that your drones were going to cause trouble today. People are watching your company, Ms. Nyong'o. They're tracking your delivery routes, predicting your failures. Amara felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying someone is sabotaging us? I'm saying your technology is so predictable that street vendors can anticipate your crashes. And if they can predict them. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Maybe someone is deliberately causing them. Before Amara could respond, her phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and his voice was panicked when she answered. "Ma'am, we have a crisis. 3 more drones just crashed simultaneously, all in different parts of the city, all at exactly the same time." Amara's heart stopped. "That's impossible. Our drones operate independently." "That's what I thought. But ma'am, someone hacked our central control system. They're sending our drones directly into obstacles. This isn't accidental anymore." She looked at Joseph, who was already standing up. "Someone wants to destroy your company," he said quietly. "And they're using the very networks I just described to do it." A homeless man speaks 7 languages and knows secrets billion-dollar algorithms can't crack. Like if you're shocked by Joseph's hidden knowledge. What language barrier have you struggled with? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe because next chapter brings fire, literally. The Swift Deliver headquarters buzzed with panicked energy as Amara and Joseph rode the elevator to the 20th floor. Through the glass walls, she could see her engineering team clustered around computer screens, their faces illuminated by red warning lights that flashed across multiple monitoring systems. "Ma'am," Marcus rushed toward them as soon as the elevator doors opened. "The situation is worse than I reported. Someone didn't just hack our system. They've been inside for weeks, maybe months, studying our flight patterns and delivery algorithms." Joseph moved quietly to the windows, looking down at the streets below while Amara absorbed the devastating news. "How much data do they access?" she asked. "Everything. Customer information, delivery schedules, drone specifications, flight paths, even our upcoming product launches." Marcus's voice cracked. "Whoever did this knows our system better than we do." Amara sank into her chair, the weight of the revelation crushing down on her. "Any demands? Ransom requests?" "Nothing. They're not trying to steal money or sell our secrets. They're systematically destroying our reputation. Each crash is calculated to cause maximum public relations damage." Joseph turned from the window. "May I see the crash data?" Marcus looked at Amara uncertainly. "Ma'am, this is highly confidential technical information." "Show him," Amara said quietly. "At this point, we need all the help we can get." Marcus reluctantly pulled up holographic displays showing the 3 most recent crashes. Joseph studied the data for several minutes, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "These locations aren't random," he said finally. "This morning's crashes hit 3 different community centers during their busiest hours. Whoever planned this understands the social significance of each location." "What do you mean?" Joseph pointed at the first crash site. The Kariakou Market crash happened during the morning rush when mothers bring their children to buy school supplies. Maximum emotional impact, drones threatening families. He moved to the second display. The mosque crash occurred during afternoon prayers. Maximum religious sensitivity, technology disrupting spiritual practice. Finally, the third crash. And the hospital crash happened during visiting hours when people are already anxious about their loved ones. Maximum fear factor, drones endangering the sick. Marcus stared at the data with new understanding. "You're saying whoever is doing this knows exactly how to turn public opinion against us." "More than that," Joseph said grimly. "They understand African community psychology. Each crash was designed to activate specific cultural fears about foreign technology, threatening traditional values." Amara felt pieces clicking together. Someone wants to kill African drone technology entirely. Not just my company, the whole industry. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop building your flying machines, or the next crash will have casualties. You have 24 hours to announce the permanent shutdown of Swift Deliver." The room fell silent as everyone read the message. "We need to call the police," Marcus said immediately. "No," Joseph said sharply. "Police involvement will only confirm that your company is under criminal attack. The media will have a field day. Your stock price will crash even faster." "Then what do you suggest?" Amara asked. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying the crash data again. "I need to make some phone calls. There are people in this city who might know who's behind this." What kind of people? The kind who hear everything but say nothing. Information brokers, network facilitators, community connectors. He paused. People who exist in the spaces between official channels. Amara realized he was talking about the same underground networks he described earlier. The invisible communication systems that her drones couldn't access. Can you trust them? Joseph's expression was complicated. Some of them. Maybe. I've been out of the game for 8 months. Trust expires quickly on the streets. He borrowed Marcus's phone and walked to a corner of the office, speaking quietly in what sounded like several different languages. Amara watched him work, noticing how his posture changed with each conversation. Sometimes deferential, sometimes authoritative, always respectful. After 20 minutes, he returned, his face grim. I have good news and bad news, he said. Bad news first. The attacks on your company are being coordinated by someone with serious resources and deep local knowledge. They're not just hacking your systems. They're manipulating the social networks that I described. Spreading rumors, amplifying fears, turning public opinion against drone technology. And the good news? I know someone who might be able to identify who's behind this. But he hesitated. She won't meet with you directly. She doesn't trust corporate executives, especially foreign-educated ones. I was born in Nairobi, Amara protested. But you went to Stanford for your MBA and MIT for your engineering degree. In certain circles, that makes you an outsider who's lost touch with African realities. The accusation stung because it contained truth. Amara had spent 6 years in America, absorbing Silicon Valley thinking about disruption and scalable solutions. She'd returned to Africa with confidence that technology could solve problems faster than traditional approaches. What does she need from me? Proof that you're willing to listen to African wisdom instead of imposing American solutions. She wants you to come alone, unarmed with bodyguards or lawyers or consultants. Just you learning how this city really works. Amara looked around her high-tech office, at the floor-to-ceiling windows and imported marble floors and holographic displays. Everything here represented her success, but also her distance from the streets below. Where does she want to meet? The Mchikichini Fish Market at dawn tomorrow. It's where information flows most freely in Dar es Salaam. If someone is manipulating the social networks, she'll know about it. Marcus stepped forward. Ma'am, I strongly advise against this. Meeting some unknown contact in a fish market could be dangerous. More dangerous than losing everything I've built? Amara asked. Before anyone could answer, the building's fire alarm began blaring. Red lights flashed throughout the office as an automated voice announced, "This is not a drill. Please evacuate immediately." They rushed to the windows and looked down to see smoke rising from the building's parking garage. Fire trucks were already arriving, but through the smoke, Amara could see something that made her blood run cold. The wreckage of another drone, this one carrying a small incendiary device, was burning in the middle of the parking structure. They just escalated, Joseph said quietly. This isn't about destroying your reputation anymore. They're willing to burn down your headquarters. Amara's phone buzzed with another message. You have 12 hours now. Shut down Swift Deliver, or the next fire won't be in an empty parking garage. As they evacuated the building, joining the stream of frightened employees flooding down the emergency stairwells, Amara realized that whoever was attacking her company had just declared war. And the only person who might be able to help her was a homeless man whose trust she hadn't earned and whose underground contacts she didn't understand. Tomorrow's meeting at the fish market wasn't just about saving her company anymore. It was about survival. Arsonists attack Billionaire's headquarters. Someone just escalated this war to a whole new level. Smash like if you think Amara is in real danger now. Who do you think is behind these attacks? Drop your theories below. Subscribe. Next chapter reveals who the real enemy is. The Mchikichini Fish Market came alive before sunrise, the air thick with salt and diesel fumes as fishing boats returned from the Indian Ocean. Amara arrived at 5:30 a.m., having barely slept after the previous day's fire at her headquarters. She traded her designer suit for simple jeans and a cotton shirt, following Joseph's advice to blend in rather than stand out. Joseph was waiting for her near the main dock, speaking quietly with a woman who looked to be in her 50s. The woman had graying hair wrapped in a colorful kanga, and her hands moved with the quick precision of someone who had been filleting fish for decades. Despite her humble appearance, there was something commanding in her posture that made Amara approach respectfully. "Mama Zubeda," Joseph said in Swahili, then switched to English. "This is Amara Nyong'o." The older woman studied Amara with sharp, intelligent eyes. "So you're the drone lady, the one who thinks machines can do what people have been doing for centuries." "I'm trying to help people," Amara said carefully. "Faster deliveries, better access to medical supplies, economic opportunities." Mama Zubeda gestured for them to walk with her as she moved between the fish stalls. "Joseph tells me someone is sabotaging your flying machines, making them crash into weddings and mosques." "That's right. We think someone is hacking our systems and manipulating public opinion against us." Mama Zubeda stopped at a stall where a young man was arranging red snapper on ice. She spoke to him briefly in Swahili, and he nodded, pointing toward the harbor. "This is my nephew Juma," she explained to Amara. "He was at the mosque when your drone crashed yesterday. Tell her what you saw." Juma looked nervous about speaking to Amara directly. "The drone came from the wrong direction," he said in careful English. "Normally, your machines fly straight lines, but this one made turns like someone was controlling it manually." "That's impossible," Amara said. "Our drones are autonomous. They follow predetermined flight paths." "Maybe your drones are autonomous," Mama Zubeda said, "but someone else's drones look exactly like yours." The implication hit Amara like a physical blow. "You're saying someone is building identical drones and crashing them deliberately?" "I'm saying that in a market like this, you learn to tell the difference between fresh fish and yesterday's catch, even when they look the same." Mama Zubeda's voice was gentle but firm. "Your real drones have a different sound, different flight pattern. The ones that crash are different." Joseph nodded grimly. "That's why the hacking explanation never made sense to me. Your security systems are too sophisticated for simple hacking. But if someone is manufacturing duplicate drones, they could crash them anywhere, anytime, and everyone would blame Swift Deliver," Amara finished. They continued walking through the market, passing vendors who called out morning greetings to Mama Zubeda in various languages. It was clear she was respected and well-connected throughout the community. "There's something else," Mama Zubeda said as they reached a quieter section of the market. "The person doing this, they're not Tanzanian." "How do you know?" "Because they don't understand how information flows here. A local person would know that destroying your company wouldn't stop drone technology in Africa. They would know that other companies would just take your place." She stopped walking and looked directly at Amara. "But a foreigner might think that if they destroy the biggest African drone company, they can control the entire market." "You mean a foreign competitor?" "I mean someone who sees Africa as a market to be controlled rather than a community to serve." Mama Zubeda's expression hardened. "Someone who thinks that if they can't have the African drone market, no one should." Amara felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Swift Deliver had been gaining international attention, winning contracts that might otherwise go to European or American companies. If a foreign competitor wanted to eliminate African competition, "Do you know who it is?" she asked. "I have suspicions, but proving it will be dangerous." Mama Zubeda looked at Joseph. "You'll need to reconnect with networks you've been away from for months. Some people won't trust you anymore." Joseph nodded soberly. "I understand. And you," she turned to Amara, "will need to do something that terrifies most business executives." "What's that?" "You'll need to trust African solutions instead of trying to fix this with lawyers and technology." Mama Zubeda's voice was serious. "Can you do that?" Before Amara could answer, commotion erupted from the direction of the main harbor. People were pointing at the sky, shouting in alarm. Above the fishing boats, 3 drones were approaching in tight formation, but these weren't Swift Deliver models. These drones were larger, painted military green, and they were dropping something into the water near the fishing boats. "Get down," Joseph yelled, pulling both women behind a concrete barrier. The objects the drones dropped weren't bombs, they were speakers. Loud, Harsh voices began broadcasting across the harbor in English and Swahili. Attention citizens of Dar es Salaam. Swift-deliver drones are dangerous to your families and your communities. Demand that your government shut down all drone operations immediately. The message repeated while the 3 military-style drones circled the harbor like vultures. Those aren't your machines, Mama Zubeda said grimly. No, Amara confirmed. Those are professional surveillance drones. Military grade. Probably worth 50 times what our delivery drones cost. The broadcasting continued for several minutes before the drones retreated toward the ocean. But the damage was done. Fishermen were pulling out their phones, recording videos, sharing the propaganda message across social media. They're escalating again, Joseph observed. Public intimidation campaigns. Mama Zubeda stood up slowly, brushing dust off her kanga. Now I know for certain who we're dealing with. Ooh, someone with access to military equipment and international communications resources. Someone who can coordinate sophisticated psychological operations across multiple cities. She looked directly at Amara. This isn't a local competitor or a criminal hacker. This is corporate warfare. Amara's phone buzzed with an urgent call from Marcus. Ma'am, we have a crisis. The government just announced they're launching a formal investigation into all drone operations in Tanzania. They're demanding access to all our technical specifications and operational data. That's impossible. Our patents and proprietary technology. Ma'am, if we don't comply, they're threatening to arrest you for endangering public safety. Amara closed her eyes, feeling the walls closing in. Whoever was behind this had just triggered government intervention, turning her into a criminal suspect. There's more, Marcus continued. Similar investigations are being launched in Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda, all simultaneously, all with identical language about drone safety concerns. Coordinated international pressure, Joseph said quietly when she hung up. Professional-level corporate sabotage. Mama Zubeda nodded. Now you understand what you're really fighting. Not just business competition, but people who want to control African technology development from the outside. What do? You learn to fight like an African, Mama Zubeda said firmly. Using networks they can't see and strategies they don't understand. She turned to walk away, then paused. Meet me tomorrow night at the Uhuru Monument. Bring nothing electronic. No phones, no computers, no recording devices. We're going to introduce you to the real power structure of this city. As Mama Zubeda disappeared into the crowd of mourning vendors, Amara realized that her war against invisible enemies had just become something much larger. She wasn't just fighting to save her company anymore. She was fighting for the future of African technological independence. Fish Market holds the key to defeating billion-dollar enemies. Mama Zubeda drops bombshells about who is really attacking Amara's company. Like if you never saw this twist coming. Comment. What's the most unexpected place you've learned something important? Subscribe for next chapter is game-changing revelations. The next evening, Amara stood alone at the Uhuru Monument as the sun set over Dar es Salaam harbor. She'd left her phone, laptop, and even her smartwatch at home, feeling strangely naked without the digital devices that normally connected her to her business empire. The monument, celebrating Tanzania's independence, felt appropriate for what Mama Zubeda had called learning to fight like an African. Joseph emerged from the shadows first, followed by Mama Zubeda and 3 other people Amara didn't recognize, 2 men and another woman, all dressed in simple clothing but carrying themselves with quiet authority. These are the information keepers, Mama Zubeda said without preamble. People who understand how news travels in East Africa faster than your internet. The older the 2 men stepped forward. I am Pastor Kivuli from the Lutheran Church Network. We coordinate information across 17 countries. His English was precise, educated. Your enemy has made a mistake. They're trying to manipulate African communication networks, but they don't understand how they actually work. The woman, younger than Mama Zubeda, but with similar sharp intelligence, spoke next. I'm Dr. Amina Hassan. I run health clinics in 3 countries and coordinate medical supply networks. We've been watching the attacks on your delivery system with interest. The second man was built like a former soldier, with scars on his hands and a way of scanning the environment that suggested military training. Colonel Mwangi, retired Tanzania People's Defense Force. I now work with veteran networks across East Africa. Amara felt overwhelmed by the level of organization and connectivity these people represented. Joseph said, "You might know who's behind the attacks on my company." "We know exactly who it is," Pastor Kivuli said grimly. "But the proof will shock you." Dr. Hassan pulled out a folder of photographs and documents. 3 weeks ago, unusual equipment started arriving at Mwangi International Airport. Officially, it was listed as agricultural surveying equipment imported by something called East Africa Development Solutions. She showed Amara shipping manifests and customs documents. But agricultural surveyors don't need military-grade communication jammers and drone manufacturing equipment. Colonel Mwangi took over the explanation. "We tracked the equipment to a warehouse in the industrial district. The company is registered in Switzerland, but the technical staff are all from a German defense contractor called Schwarzkopf Systems." "I've never heard of them," Amara said. "Most people haven't. They specialize in what they call market preparation, destabilizing local competitors before major European companies enter new markets." Pastor Kivuli opened another folder. "Schwarzkopf has done this before. In Ghana, they sabotaged local solar companies right before a major German energy corporation entered the West African market. In Kenya, they disrupted local telecommunications just before a European mobile provider launched operations. The pattern was becoming clear, and it made Amara feel sick. Someone hired them to destroy African drone companies before launching their own operations. "Not someone," Dr. Hassan said quietly. "We know exactly who hired them." She placed a final photograph on the table. It showed a well-dressed white woman in her 40s shaking hands with what appeared to be Schwarzkopf executives in front of a building marked EuroTech Industries. Elizabeth Morrison, CEO of EuroTech Industries. They're Europe's largest logistics and delivery company. They've been trying to enter the African market for 3 years, but companies like yours kept underbidding them for government contracts. Amara stared at the photograph. So they decided to eliminate the competition. More than that, Colonel Mwangi said, they wanted to prove that African companies couldn't be trusted with advanced technology. Create enough disasters, generate enough fear, and African governments would welcome European companies as safer alternatives. The sophisticated nature of the sabotage suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't random corporate competition. It was systematic economic colonialism, using modern technology to achieve the same goals that European powers have pursued in Africa for centuries. "We have more bad news," Pastor Kivuli said. "Tomorrow morning, EuroTech is announcing their new African Safety Initiative, a comprehensive drone delivery system that they claim will be much safer than local alternatives." "The timing isn't coincidental," Dr. Hassan added. "They've spent months destroying your reputation so they could position themselves as the solution to problems they created." Amara felt rage building in her chest. "How do we stop them?" "That's where it gets complicated," Mama Zubeda said, speaking for the first time since the introductions. "Traditional approaches won't work. Legal challenges will take years. Government complaints will get buried in bureaucracy. Media campaigns will be outspent by EuroTech's marketing budget. Then what do you suggest?" The 5 community leaders exchanged meaningful looks, as if they'd already discussed this among themselves. "We fight using African networks," Colonel Mwangi said. "Systems they can't penetrate or manipulate. Information warfare using trust instead of technology," Pastor Kivuli added. Dr. Hassan leaned forward. "We can spread the truth about Schwarzkopf and EuroTech faster than they can spread their lies. Church networks, medical networks, veteran networks, market networks. When we work together, we can reach every community in East Africa within hours." But Mama Zubeda's voice carried a warning. This kind of fight requires complete trust. No holding back information, no corporate secrecy, no trying to control the narrative. You have to let African communities decide how to respond. Amara felt the weight of the decision. Everything in her business training screamed against giving up control of her company's messaging and strategy. But everything she'd learned over the past few days suggested that traditional approaches had already failed. "What do you need from me?" "Complete transparency," Joseph said. "Technical specifications for your real drones versus the fake ones Schwarzkopf is building. Financial records proving your African ownership versus EuroTech's foreign backing. Production facilities, employment numbers, local supplier relationships. And access to your delivery network data," Colonel Mwangi added. "We need to prove that your drones serve African communities while EuroTech's proposed system will extract wealth to European shareholders." Amara hesitated. "That information is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. If it gets into the wrong hands." "It's already in the wrong hands," Dr. Hassan pointed out. "Schwarzkopf has been studying your operations for months. The question is whether you trust African networks enough to share it with the right hands." The group fell silent, waiting for her decision. In the distance, Amara could hear the sounds of the city. Traffic, music, conversations in multiple languages, the complex symphony of 7 million people living and working together. "Okay," she said quietly. "What do you need me to do?" "First, we need you to publicly challenge EuroTech," Pastor Kivuli said. "Tomorrow morning, before their press conference, you're going to announce that Swift Deliver is not just a Tanzanian company. It's an African company, owned by Africans, serving African communities." And then, Mama Zubeda smiled for the first time that evening. "Then we show EuroTech what happens when they try to manipulate networks they don't understand." Before Amara could ask what that meant, Joseph's borrowed phone buzzed with an urgent message. His face went pale as he read it. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "Schwarzkopf just accelerated their timeline. They're not waiting for tomorrow's press conference." "What do you mean?" "They're launching a coordinated attack tonight. Multiple fake Swift Deliver drones are going to crash simultaneously across 3 different cities: Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, and Kampala, all targeting high-visibility locations during evening prayers and dinner hours." Colonel Mwangi stood up immediately. "How many crashes?" 12 total, per city. Designed to look like a complete system failure that endangers civilians across East Africa. Dr. Hassan was already pulling out her phone. "If that many drones crash tonight, every government in the region will ban all drone operations tomorrow morning." Which gives EuroTech a clear field to present themselves as the safe alternative, Amara realized. Mama Zubeda's expression had turned deadly serious. "How long do we have?" Joseph checked the message again. "The first crashes start in 4 hours. Then we have 4 hours to beat them at their own game," Pastor Kivuli said grimly. "Ow!" "By doing something they never expected," Mama Zubeda said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We're going to turn their weapon against them." Amara felt her heart racing. "What are you talking about?" Colonel Mwangi was already moving toward his vehicle. "We're going to intercept those fake drones before they crash. Capture them, prove they're not yours, and broadcast the evidence across every network in East Africa before EuroTech's press conference tomorrow." "That's impossible," Amara protested. "We don't even know where they're launching from." "We know exactly where they're launching from," Dr. Hassan said with a grim smile. "We've been watching that warehouse for 3 weeks." Joseph grabbed Amara's arm. "This is it. This is where we either save your company and expose the truth, or lose everything." "What do you need me to do?" "Be ready to prove that those aren't your drones," Mama Zubeda said. "When we capture them, you'll have one chance to show all of East Africa the difference between African innovation and European manipulation." As the group dispersed into the Dar es Salaam night, each heading to coordinate different aspects of what felt like a military operation, Amara realized that the next 4 hours would determine not just the fate of her company, but the future of technological independence across East Africa. The war for African skies was about to begin. African networks versus European corporations. The real war begins now. These community leaders have a plan that will shock you. Like if you think they can beat billion-dollar enemies. What hidden network in your community could change everything? Comment below. Subscribe. Next chapter is the most intense yet. At 11 p.m., Amara crouched behind shipping containers in the industrial district, watching the Schwarzkopf warehouse through night vision binoculars that Colonel Mwangi had somehow procured. The building was bustling with activity. Technicians in white coats loading equipment into unmarked vans while security guards patrolled the perimeter. 12 fake drones, 4 delivery destinations per city, launching in 47 minutes, Joseph whispered, monitoring communications through a modified radio scanner. They're using military precision timing. Dr. Hassan's voice crackled through their encrypted radios from her position near the warehouse's rear exit. Medical teams are standing by in all 3 cities. They're expecting casualties from these crashes. The coldness of that statement hit Amara like a physical blow. EuroTech and Schwarzkopf weren't just planning to destroy her company. They were willing to hurt innocent people to achieve their goals. Pastor Kivuli, what's your status? Colonel Mwangi spoke quietly into his headset. Church networks are activated across the region. The moment we have evidence, we can broadcast it to every parish, mosque, and temple in East Africa within minutes. Mama Zubeda's voice joined the communication network. Market vendors are positioned at each crash location. If fake drones go down, we'll have witnesses recording everything before official authorities arrive. Amara marveled at the level of organization these community leaders had assembled in just 4 hours. It was like watching a shadow military operation, but instead of soldiers, it was powered by pastors, doctors, market vendors, and mechanics. The invisible networks that actually held African society together. Movement at the front gate, Colonel Mwangi reported. 3 vans leaving the warehouse. Those are our targets. The plan was ambitious and dangerous. Instead of trying to stop the fake drones after they crashed, they were going to intercept them during flight, force them down safely, and document the evidence that they weren't Swift Deliver products. Van 1 is heading toward the Harbor District, Joseph reported, tracking the vehicles through his scanner. Van 2 toward the university. Van 3 toward the airport road. Teams Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, you're cleared to engage, Colonel Mwangi said with military precision. Amara watched through her binoculars as 3 groups of people emerged from hiding spots around the industrial district. Each team consisted of about 8 individuals, former military personnel, telecommunications technicians, and what looked like drone enthusiasts with modified equipment. How did you organize all this so quickly? She asked Colonel Mwangi. Same networks that told us about the wedding 3 days ago, he replied. When African communities decide to work together, we move fast. The first interception happened near the harbor. Team Alpha had positioned themselves with signal jammers and capture nets along the route where Van 1 was supposed to launch its fake drones. Amara listened through the radio as the operation unfolded. Van 1 has stopped. They're setting up launch equipment. For drones visible. Signal jammers activated. We've disrupted their communications. Drones launching anyway. They're running on preset programs. Nets deployed. We've got 1 drone down safely. 2nd drone captured. 3rd drone, wait, it's changing course. Amara held her breath. If even 1 fake drone crashed and caused injuries, the whole operation would fail. 3rd drone secured. 4th drone is heading back to the van. They're trying to abort. Van 1 team is retreating. We've got 3 fake drones and video evidence of the 4th. Similar reports came in from teams Bravo and Charlie. Within 30 minutes, they had captured 9 of the 12 fake drones and forced the others to return to their launch points without crashing. Phase 2 initiated, Pastor Kivuli announced over the radio. Amara watched in amazement as the captured fake drones were transported to a central location, the parking lot of the national television station, where powerful floodlights illuminated them for a crowd of witnesses and journalists. Broadcasting live to 17 countries, Dr. Hassan reported. Medical networks, church networks, veteran networks, student networks. Everyone is watching. Joseph handed Amara a microphone connected to a portable broadcasting system. Your turn. Show East Africa the difference between real, Swift-delivered drones and Schwarzkopf's fakes. Amara stepped into the floodlight, her heart pounding. Dozens of cameras were recording, hundreds of people were watching in person, and thousands more were watching through live streams across multiple networks. My name is Amara Nyong'o, and I'm the founder of Swift Deliver, she began, her voice stronger than she felt. For the past week, fake drones designed to look like ours have been crashing across East Africa, causing fear and damaging trust in African technology. She walked to the captured drones, pointing out specific details. These machines were manufactured in Germany by Schwarzkopf Systems, working for EuroTech Industries. Look at the serial numbers. They're not in our system. Look at the construction, different materials, different electronics, different flight software. Joseph handed her a real, Swift-deliver drone for comparison. Our drones are built in Nairobi using African suppliers and African engineers. They're designed to work with African communities, not against them. The crowd was growing as people streamed into the television station parking lot. Amara could see the demonstration being shared across social media platforms in real time. But this isn't just about my company, she continued, feeling the power of speaking truth to a receptive audience. This is about whether Africans control our own technological development or whether foreign corporations can manipulate our governments and communities through fear. Pastor Kivili stepped forward, speaking in Swahili and then English. For centuries, outsiders have told us that African solutions aren't good enough, that we need European guidance and expertise. Tonight, African networks have proven that we can defend ourselves against deception and manipulation. Dr. Hassan added her voice. These fake crashes were designed to hurt real people. The medical teams standing by tonight expected to treat victims of European corporate warfare disguised as African incompetence. Colonel Mwangi held up documents that had been recovered from the Schwarzkopf warehouse. We have internal communications proving this operation was planned and funded by EuroTech Industries. They wanted to create fear so African governments would welcome European companies as safer alternatives. The crowd responded with anger, but also with pride. Amara could feel the mood shifting from defensive to empowered. What happens now? Someone called out from the audience. Mama Zubeda stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of decades in African communities. Now we show the world what African networks can accomplish when we work together. She gestured to the captured drones. Tonight, we prevented 12 crashes across 3 countries using communication systems that no foreign corporation can control or manipulate. We coordinated responses faster than any government agency or military unit. And tomorrow, Pastor Kivili added, when EuroTech announces their African safety initiative, the whole continent will know they're trying to sell us solutions to problems they created. The demonstration was being broadcast live, but Amara could see that something bigger was happening. People were pulling out phones, not just to record, but to call others, to spread the news through personal networks that extended far beyond social media. The information is moving, Joseph said quietly, monitoring multiple communication channels. Church networks, family networks, business networks. The truth is spreading faster than any corporate marketing campaign. But as Amara savored this moment of vindication, her phone buzzed with an urgent message that made her blood run cold. The text was from the same unknown number that had threatened her before. Impressive performance. But you've forgotten that we still have your real weakness. Check your bank accounts. She quickly accessed her company's financial information and felt the world tilt around her. Swift Deliver's accounts had been completely drained. Every dollar, every contract payment, every investor deposit gone. They've stolen everything, she whispered to Joseph. He looked at her phone, and his expression went grim. Electronic warfare. While we were fighting their physical attacks, they were stealing your digital assets. The crowd was still celebrating, still sharing the truth about the fake drones, but Amara realized that EuroTech had just delivered a killing blow. Even if she'd won the battle for public opinion, her company was now financially destroyed. The war was far from over. Midnight Raid exposes the truth. Military precision meets community power in this incredible operation. Smash like if this nighttime mission gave you chills. Have you ever had to expose someone's lies? Share your story below. Subscribe because next chapter's confrontation will leave you speechless. The next morning, Amara sat in her emptied office, staring at computer screens that showed nothing but zeros where her company's assets used to be. Marcus had arrived early and spent 3 hours confirming what she already knew. Swift Deliver had been financially assassinated with surgical precision. They didn't just steal the money, he explained, his voice hollow with exhaustion. They manipulated our banking relationships, triggered default clauses in our contracts, and somehow convinced our insurance company that we're no longer covered for any claims. Joseph entered the office carrying breakfast from a street vendor, looking surprisingly calm given the disaster. The good news is that last night's demonstration worked. EuroTech's press conference was a complete failure. No African government is welcoming their safety initiative after seeing proof that they created the dangers. The bad news is that we're bankrupt, Amara said bitterly. I can't pay my employees, can't fulfill contracts, can't even afford to keep this office open. Actually, Joseph said carefully, there might be another option. What kind of option? Before he could answer, the elevator doors opened and Mama Zubeda walked in, accompanied by Pastor Kivuli, Dr. Hassan, and Colonel Mwangi. They looked like they were arriving for a business meeting, which confused Amara since she no longer had a business. We've been talking all night, Pastor Kivuli said without preamble, about what happened to your company and what it means for African technological independence. EuroTech won, Amara said. They destroyed my reputation, then stole my money. I'm finished. You're only finished if you think like a corporate executive instead of an African entrepreneur, Dr. Hassan said. Tell her, Mama Zubeda. The older woman sat down across from Amara, her expression serious but not unsympathetic. In traditional African economies, wealth isn't just money in bank accounts. Wealth is relationships, knowledge, trust, and community support. That's very philosophical, but I need actual money to run a business. Do you? Colonel Mwangi asked. Let's examine what Swift Deliver actually is. You have technological knowledge, the ability to build and operate drones. You have operational knowledge, understanding of African logistics needs. You have a workforce, 12,000 employees across 6 countries who believe in what you're building, all of which is worthless without capital. Unless, Joseph said quietly, you rebuild using African capital instead of international banking systems. Amara looked at him skeptically. What do you mean? Pastor Kivuli opened a folder filled with documents. The church networks across East Africa have been discussing this since last night. We represent millions of people who need the services your drones provide: medical deliveries, supply chain support, emergency communications. We're prepared to offer you something EuroTech can't steal, Dr. Hassan added. Community investment. Direct funding from the people who will actually use your services. Amara felt a flicker of hope, but tried to stay realistic. How much are we talking about? My company needs tens of millions of dollars to restart operations. Colonel Mwangi smiled. Show her the numbers, Pastor. Pastor Kivuli spread out financial documents across Amara's desk. Lutheran churches across 17 countries. $43 million available for community development projects. Catholic networks, $67 million. Islamic foundations, $52 million. Traditional community organizations, $38 million. Amara stared at the figures in disbelief. You're talking about $200 million in religious and community funding? More than that, Dr. Hassan said. Medical networks, veterans organizations, women's cooperatives, farmers associations. When you add up all the community-controlled resources in East Africa, we're talking about over $500 million that could be invested in locally owned technological development. But Mama Zubeda's voice carried a warning. This kind of investment comes with different expectations than bank loans or venture capital. What kind of expectations? Community ownership, Joseph explained. Instead of external shareholders extracting profits, your company would be owned by the communities it serves. Local control, local decision-making, local benefits. Amara felt overwhelmed by the implications. You're talking about completely restructuring how Swift Deliver operates. We're talking about making it immune to the kind of attacks you just experienced, Pastor Kivuli said. EuroTech could steal money from international banks, but they can't steal trust from African communities. Think about it, Colonel Mwangi added. Your drones crashed because they couldn't integrate with local communication networks. Your company was vulnerable because it relied on foreign financial systems. but if you rebuild using community ownership and local networks, you become unbreakable, Dr. Hassan finished. Amara walked to her window, looking down at the streets of Dar es Salaam. The city was bustling with morning activity, matatu drivers navigating traffic, vendors setting up stalls, people moving with purpose through complex social and economic networks that had existed for generations. What would this actually look like, she asked. Each community network becomes a shareholder, Mama Zubeda explained. Churches, medical clinics, veterans organizations, farmers' cooperatives. They provide funding, and in return, they get priority access to your services and a voice in how the company operates. Your employees become partners instead of just workers, Joseph added. Local production, local ownership, local control. And your drones integrate with community communication networks instead of trying to replace them, Pastor Kivuli concluded. It was a radically different vision of how to run a technology company. Instead of pursuing maximum growth and external investment, it prioritized local ownership and community benefit. Instead of competing with existing networks, it would integrate with them. There's one more thing, Dr. Hassan said quietly. This model isn't just about rebuilding your company. It's about proving that African communities can control their own technological development. EuroTech assumed they could manipulate us because they think Africans are too disorganized to coordinate effective responses, Colonel Mwangi added. Last night, we proved them wrong about community organization. Now, we can prove them wrong about economic organization. Amara felt the weight of the decision. She could try to rebuild Swift Deliver using traditional business methods, assuming she could find new investors and lenders after the disasters of the past week. Or she could embrace a completely different model that had never been tested at this scale. If I agree to this, she said slowly, I'm not just rebuilding my company. I'm creating a new model for African technology companies. Exactly, Mama Zubeda said. The question is whether you trust African communities enough to let them own African solutions. Before Amara could answer, Marcus burst into the office, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. Ma'am, we have breaking news. EuroTech just announced they're pulling out of Africa entirely. But there's something else, something big. What? Schwarzkopf Systems has been exposed as operating illegally in 14 African countries. Their contracts are being canceled, their personnel are being expelled, and government across the continent are demanding investigations. How did that happen so fast? Marcus showed her his tablet, which displayed news reports from across Africa. The networks that supported you last night, they didn't just expose the fake drones. They spent the morning sharing information about every Schwarzkopf operation across the continent. Joseph smiled grimly. African information networks move faster than European corporate communications. By dawn, every government in the region knew about Schwarzkopf's other operations. But here's the really big news, Marcus continued. The African Union is announcing a new initiative for continental technology development. They want to support locally owned companies that can provide alternatives to foreign corporate control. Pastor Kivuli nodded. We may have influenced that announcement. Church networks have significant relationships with government officials across the continent. Amara realized that the community networks hadn't just helped her fight EuroTech. They had triggered a continental shift toward African technological independence. The offer on her desk suddenly looked like much more than rebuilding her company. It looked like building the future. But as she reached for the documents to review the community investment proposal, her phone rang with a call that would change everything again. The number was blocked, but when she answered, the voice was unmistakably American and unmistakably threatening. Ms. Nyong'o, this is Elizabeth Morrison, CEO of EuroTech Industries. We need to meet. Tonight. Alone. Or your family in Nairobi becomes our next target. Live TV exposure changes everything. Watch Amara turn the tables on her enemies in epic fashion, like if you're proud of how she fought back. What's the boldest thing you've done to stand up for yourself? Comment your story. Subscribe. Next chapter brings the ultimate showdown. That evening, Amara sat alone in the empty restaurant of the Kilimanjaro Hotel, waiting for Elizabeth Morrison. She'd insisted on a public location despite Morrison's demand for privacy, and Joseph was stationed at the bar with Colonel Mwangi's backup team spread throughout the hotel lobby. Morrison arrived exactly on time. A woman in her 40s with platinum blonde hair and the kind of expensive suit that screamed European executive. She moved with predatory confidence, scanning the restaurant before sitting across from Amara. "You've caused me considerable trouble," Morrison said without preamble, her accent crisp and upper-class British. "My board is furious. My investors are demanding answers. My African expansion plans have been completely derailed." "Good," Amara replied calmly. "Maybe next time you won't try to terrorize innocent people to eliminate business competition." Morrison laughed, a cold sound that held no humor. "Terrorize? My dear girl, you have no idea what real corporate warfare looks like. What we did to your little company was just a gentle warning. A gentle warning that included arson and theft. Standard market preparation. Every major corporation uses similar tactics when entering new territories." Morrison leaned forward, her blue eyes hard as ice. "The difference is that most local competitors are smart enough to accept buyout offers instead of fighting back." Amara felt anger building in her chest. "So this was all about forcing me to sell Swift Deliver to EuroTech. Of course, African drone technology has potential, but it needs proper European management to scale globally. Your little community networks and local ownership models are quaint, but they're not scalable. They were scalable enough to destroy your operation in one night." Morrison's smile faltered for the first time. "A temporary setback. You've won a battle, not a war." She opened her briefcase and placed a contract on the table. "EuroTech is prepared to offer you $50 million for all Swift Deliver assets, patents, and operational knowledge. You'll be retained as a consulting advisor for the African market with a very generous salary." Amara glanced at the contract without touching it. "And if I refuse? Then we escalate to methods that will make the past week look like a friendly business negotiation." Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper. "I know where your parents live in Nairobi. I know where your sister works in Kampala. I know about your younger brother's engineering program at the University of Cape Town." The threat was delivered so casually that it took Amara a moment to process its full meaning. "You're threatening my family. I'm offering you a choice. Take the $50 million and help us build a proper European-managed drone network across Africa, or watch everything you care about get systematically destroyed." Amara felt her hands trembling with rage. "You're talking about kidnapping. Murder. I'm talking about business. This is how global markets work, Ms. Nyong'o. Local companies either get absorbed by multinationals or they get eliminated. Your community networks and African solidarity are charming, but they can't protect you from serious corporate power." Morrison stood up, leaving the contract on the table. "You have 24 hours to decide. Sign the papers or face consequences that will make drone crashes look trivial." She walked toward the restaurant exit, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Ms. Nyong'o, that little demonstration you staged last night, we recorded everything. We know exactly who helped you, and we have extensive files on all your community network friends. Pastor Kivuli's churches receive funding from European development organizations we influence. Dr. Hassan's medical clinics depend on pharmaceutical companies we partner with. Colonel Mwangi's veteran programs rely on international aid we can redirect." Amara felt cold, understanding wash over her. "You're threatening them too. I'm explaining reality. Cross us, and everyone who helped you will find their funding mysteriously disappearing, their permits getting revoked, their operations facing unexpected legal challenges." Morrison's smile was predatory. Community networks are only as strong as their weakest economic links. As Morrison left the restaurant, Amara sat staring at the contract, feeling the walls closing in again. Just when she'd found hope through community investment and African solidarity, EuroTech had revealed that they could attack the very networks she'd come to depend on. Joseph appeared at her table immediately after Morrison left. "We recorded everything," he said quietly. "The threats, the intimidation, the admission of corporate sabotage. It doesn't matter," Amara said, feeling defeated. "She's right about the economic pressure. If EuroTech targets funding for churches, medical clinics, and veteran programs, they can destroy the community networks that offered to help me. Maybe. Or maybe she's underestimating how deep those networks really go. Before Amara could ask what he meant, her phone buzzed with a text from Pastor Kivuli. Emergency meeting. Uhuru Monument. 1 hour. Bring Morrison's contract. An hour later, Amara found herself surrounded by not just the original 5 community leaders, but dozens of others. Representatives from women's cooperatives, farmers' associations, students' organizations, and groups she'd never heard of. Pastor Kivuli spoke first. We know about Morrison's threats. Her conversation was monitored by several of our networks. Then you understand why I might have to take her offer, Amara said quietly. I can't let her destroy your organizations just to protect my company. You're thinking like an individual instead of a community, Mama Zubeda said firmly. Morrison assumes she can pressure African organizations because she doesn't understand how we're really structured. Dr. Hassan stepped forward. EuroTech can threaten funding from European pharmaceutical companies. But 70% of our medical supplies come from Indian, South African, and Kenyan manufacturers who compete with European companies. Colonel Mwangi nodded. They can threaten international aid for veteran programs. But most of our support comes from African governments and private donors who want to reduce dependence on foreign military assistance. Pastor Kivuli smiled. And they can threaten European development funding for churches. But our primary support comes from our own congregations and African denominational networks that have been building independence from European missions for decades. Amara began to understand. You're saying Morrison doesn't realize how economically independent your networks have become. Exactly, said a woman Amara didn't recognize. I'm Fatima Al-Rashid, representing women's cooperatives across East Africa. EuroTech thinks they can pressure us through international development funds, but we've been building alternative economic systems for years. Another voice spoke up, a young man with the bearing of a student leader. I'm David Wanjiku from the East African Students' Union. Morrison's threats assume we depend on European universities and scholarships, but most of our higher education now happens through African institutions and South-South cooperation. The pattern became clear as more representatives spoke. Over the past 2 decades, African civil society organizations had quietly been reducing their dependence on European funding and European approval. They'd built trade relationships with Asia, economic partnerships with each other, and alternative systems that operated outside traditional Western control. Morrison is fighting yesterday's war, Mama Zubeda said with satisfaction. She's trying to use colonial-era economic pressure tactics against post-colonial African networks. So what do we do? Amara asked. We call her bluff, Pastor Kivuli said, and we show her what modern African economic power actually looks like. Dr. Hassan pulled out her phone. I'm going to make some calls to medical supply companies across Africa and Asia. By tomorrow morning, we'll have alternative suppliers for every European pharmaceutical that EuroTech might try to threaten us with. Colonel Mwangi was already coordinating with his network. Veteran organizations across 17 countries are about to discover they're much more financially independent than they realized. And I, Pastor Kivuli said with a grin, am going to introduce Morrison to the African Council of Churches, which represents over 120 million people and has been developing economic independence from European missions since the 1960s. Amara felt the energy in the group shifting from defensive to offensive. What do you need from me? Don't sign that contract, Mama Zubeda said firmly. Instead, tomorrow morning, announce the launch of the African Community Technology Initiative, a continent-wide network of locally owned technology companies supported by community investment. Use Morrison's threats as proof that foreign corporations are still trying to control African development, Fatima added. Turn her intimidation into evidence of why we need economic independence. David nodded enthusiastically. Students across Africa will rally around a technology initiative that's owned and controlled by African communities instead of foreign shareholders. The meeting continued for another hour, with representatives coordinating responses across multiple networks. Amara watched in amazement as they organized economic countermeasures, media campaigns, and political pressure that spanned the entire continent. "One more thing," Joseph said as the meeting concluded. "Morrison made a crucial mistake tonight." "What's that?" She revealed that EuroTech has been systematically researching and targeting African civil society organizations. That's exactly the kind of information that African governments and the African Union need to justify continental economic defense measures. Colonel Mwangi smiled grimly. By tomorrow afternoon, EuroTech is going to discover that threatening African communities has consequences they never anticipated. As the group dispersed into the Dar es Salaam night, Amara realized that Morrison's intimidation tactics had actually accelerated the very thing EuroTech was trying to prevent: African economic networks discovering their own power and independence. The next morning would bring the real test of whether community-based resistance could stand up to multinational corporate warfare. But for the first time since this battle began, Amara felt like she was fighting alongside allies who were stronger than her enemies realized. The next morning, Amara stood before a crowd of 500 people gathered in Uhuru Park, with live broadcasts reaching millions across Africa. Morrison's 24-hour deadline had expired an hour ago, and instead of signing EuroTech's buyout contract, Amara was about to announce something that would change African technology development forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice amplified across the park and streaming live to 17 countries. "Yesterday, a European corporate executive threatened to destroy African families and communities if we didn't surrender control of African technology companies to foreign ownership." The crowd responded with anger, but Amara raised her hand for silence. "Today, we respond to those threats by launching the African Community Technology Initiative, a continent-wide network of locally owned technology companies funded by and accountable to the communities they serve." Pastor Kivuli stepped forward with a folder of documents. "Representing church networks across Africa, we announced the establishment of the African Technology Development Fund. Initial capitalization of $200 million from religious communities committed to economic independence." Dr. Hassan joined him. "Medical networks across the continent contribute $150 million to support technology that serves African healthcare needs under African control." Colonel Mwangi added his voice. "Veteran organizations and security networks pledge $100 million to develop technology that strengthens African sovereignty instead of foreign dependence." Representative after representative stepped forward. Women's cooperatives, farmers associations, student organizations, professional networks, each announcing financial commitments that collectively totaled over $800 million in community-controlled funding. "This isn't just about rebuilding Swift Deliver," Amara explained to the crowd and the cameras. "This is about proving that African communities can control their own technological development without foreign corporate manipulation." The demonstration was being broadcast live, but more importantly, it was being shared through the community networks that had exposed EuroTech sabotage. Church congregations, medical clinics, veteran meetings, cooperative gatherings. The message was spreading through human connections that no corporation could control or monitor. Joseph monitored communications from the edge of the crowd. "International media is picking up the story," he reported. "African governments are making supportive statements. The African Union is calling for an emergency session on foreign corporate interference." But even as the crowd celebrated, Amara knew Morrison wouldn't give up easily. EuroTech had too much invested in African market penetration to accept defeat gracefully. Her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. "Ms. Nyong'o," Morrison's voice was controlled but laced with fury. "I warned you about the consequences of defying us. And I'm warning you about the consequences of threatening African communities," Amara replied. "Look around you, my dear. Your little park rally is very inspiring, but I can see at least 6 government officials in that crowd who receive funding from European development agencies we influence." Amara felt a chill of fear. Morrison was right. Several people on the organizing committee had connections to international funding sources. "In fact," Morrison continued, "by tomorrow morning, you'll discover that community networks are more vulnerable than you realized. church funding from European missions, medical supplies from Western pharmaceutical companies, educational programs supported by European universities, all of it can disappear with a few phone calls. You're bluffing, am I? Pastor Kivuli's Lutheran network receives 40% of its operational funding from German religious organizations. Dr. Hassan's medical clinics depend on supplies from Swiss pharmaceutical companies. Colonel Mwangi's veteran programs rely on EU development grants. Morrison's voice turned triumphant. By evening, all of that funding will be under review. By next week, it will be canceled. Your community networks will learn that independence has a price they can't afford. The call ended, leaving Amara staring at her phone while the celebration continued around her. Morrison had just revealed the depth of EuroTech's influence and their willingness to use economic warfare against entire African communities. But as Amara looked around at the crowd, she noticed something that Morrison might have missed. Joseph was speaking rapidly into his phone, and across the park, other organizers were making urgent calls. The community networks weren't panicking. They were activating. Pastor Kivuli approached her with a grim smile. Morrison just made her biggest mistake yet. What do you mean? She's about to cut funding for half the organizations here. She's about to try, he corrected. But what she doesn't understand is that we've been preparing for exactly this scenario for months. Dr. Hassan joined them, her phone buzzing with incoming calls. Medical networks across Africa have been building alternative supply chains since the COVID pandemic. Morrison can threaten Swiss pharmaceuticals, but we have partnerships with Indian, South African, and Brazilian manufacturers who compete with European companies. Colonel Mwangi nodded. And EU development grants represent less than 15% of veteran funding. Most of our support comes from African government programs and private donors who want to reduce foreign dependence. But what about the 40% of church funding from Germany? Amara asked Pastor Kivuli. His smile widened. That number is 5 years old. Since 2019, the African Council of Churches has been systematically shifting to self-supporting models. German funding now represents less than 8% of our budget. Amara began to understand. Morrison is working with outdated intelligence. Exactly. EuroTech hired consultants who gave them colonial-era assumptions about African economic dependence. They don't realize how much has changed in the past decade. Joseph returned from his phone calls with exciting news. Morrison's threats are backfiring spectacularly. The German religious organizations she threatened to pressure are actually issuing statements supporting African independence and condemning foreign corporate interference in African development. The Swiss pharmaceutical companies are distancing themselves from any connection to EuroTech, Dr. Hassan added. Our contacts are telling us that European businesses don't want to be associated with colonial-style economic intimidation. And the EU development agencies are launching investigations into whether EuroTech has been improperly using development funds for corporate warfare, Colonel Mwangi concluded. The irony was delicious. Morrison's attempt to demonstrate EuroTech's power had instead exposed their tactics to European organizations that didn't want to be associated with economic colonialism. There's more, Joseph said, holding up his phone. Morrison's call to you was recorded and shared across African media networks. Her threats against community organizations are now public knowledge. Amara looked at her phone and saw that social media was exploding with outrage over Morrison's intimidation tactics. Hashtag EuroTech threats was trending across Africa, with thousands of people sharing stories of foreign corporate interference in African development. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young woman approached the group, introducing herself as Sarah Okafor from the African Development Bank. Ms. Nyong'o, I've been authorized to make you an offer, she said. The African Development Bank is prepared to provide matching funds for your community technology initiative. Every dollar raised by African communities will be matched with development bank funding. Amara felt her heart racing. How much matching funding? Up to $1 billion. The bank's board met in emergency session this morning after reviewing EuroTech's threats. They've decided that African technological independence is now a continental priority. Pastor Kivuli laughed with delight. Morrison's intimidation campaign just triggered the largest technology investment in African history. It gets better, Sarah continued. The African Union is announcing new regulations that will make it illegal for foreign corporations to use economic pressure against African civil society organizations. Any company caught using EuroTech tactics will be banned from operating on the continent. As the implications sank in, Amara realized that Morrison had accidentally catalyzed exactly what EuroTech was trying to prevent. Instead of intimidating African networks into submission, she provoked them into organizing continental-scale economic defense measures. What happens now? Amara asked. Now we build the future, Mama Zubeda said, arriving with news of her own. Market networks across East Africa have spent the morning coordinating with similar networks in West, Central, and Southern Africa. We're launching a continental trade system that operates independently of European corporate control. Joseph showed Amara his phone, which displayed a map of Africa with thousands of connection points lighting up. Community networks are linking up across the continent. Churches talking to churches, medical clinics sharing resources, veteran organizations coordinating support, student networks organizing collaboration. Morrison assumed she could pressure individual networks in isolation, Dr. Hassan explained. Instead, she's triggered continental-scale cooperation between networks that had never coordinated before. The celebration in the park continued, but Amara realized they were witnessing something much larger than a business victory. They were watching the birth of a new model for African development, community-controlled, continentally coordinated, and immune to foreign corporate manipulation. Her phone rang with another call from Morrison. "You've made a serious mistake, Ms. Nyong'o." Morrison's voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "EuroTech has resources you can't imagine. We'll be back, and next time we won't be so gentle." "I'm sure you will," Amara replied calmly. "But next time, you'll be facing an entire continent that's organized to defend itself." She hung up and looked around at the crowd of African leaders, entrepreneurs, and community organizers who had transformed a corporate attack into a liberation movement. The war for African technological independence wasn't over. But for the first time in centuries, Africans held the stronger position. 500 people, 17 countries, $800 million of community power. This rally will give you goosebumps. Smash like if this unity brought tears to your eyes. What cause would make you stand up and rally? Tell us below. Subscribe for the epic final chapter that changes everything. 6 months later, Amara stood in the newly opened Swift Deliver Community Innovation Center in Dar es Salaam, watching dozens of young African engineers working alongside drone operators, community liaisons, and network coordinators. The building buzzed with multiple languages, collaborative energy, and the sound of technology being developed by and for African communities. Joseph approached her desk, no longer homeless, but serving as Swift Deliver's Director of Community Integration. His office overlooked the same streets where he'd once slept, and his deep understanding of African communication networks had become the company's most valuable asset. "Monthly report," he said, handing her a tablet. Swift Deliver Community Network now operates in 43 African cities across 12 countries. 0 crashes this month, 97% customer satisfaction, and $200 million in community investment. But the numbers that made Amara proudest weren't financial. Swift Deliver drones were delivering medical supplies to rural clinics, supporting agricultural cooperatives, enabling educational programs, and strengthening the very community networks that had saved her company. More importantly, Joseph continued, "Our model is being replicated. 17 other African technology companies have adopted community ownership structures. The African Community Technology Initiative has become a continental movement." Mama Zubeda entered the office carrying tea and the warm authority that had anchored Amara during the darkest moments of her corporate war. At 72, she now served on Swift Deliver's Community Advisory Board, ensuring that the company remained accountable to the people it served. Elizabeth Morrison called this morning, she announced with evident satisfaction. Amara looked up in surprise. "Morrison? What did she want?" "EuroTech is facing bankruptcy. Their African expansion failed completely, Their European operations are under investigation for colonial-era business practices, and their shareholders are demanding leadership changes. Joseph smiled grimly. Turns out that threatening African communities has consequences that extend far beyond Africa. European investors don't want to be associated with economic colonialism in the 21st century. Morrison asked if Swift Deliver might be interested in acquiring EuroTech's drone technology patents. Mama Zubeda continued. She was quite desperate. What did you tell her? I told her that African communities aren't interested in technologies developed through corporate warfare and economic intimidation. Mama Zubeda's eyes twinkled with mischief. But I also told her that if she wanted to learn how to build technology companies that serve communities instead of exploiting them, she was welcome to apply for our training programs. The transformation had been remarkable. Swift Deliver's community-based model had proven not only morally superior to traditional corporate structures, but also more profitable, more stable, and more innovative. When technology companies were owned by the communities they served, they developed solutions that actually worked for African realities. Pastor Kivuli arrived for their weekly coordination meeting, bringing updates from church networks across the continent. His graying hair and gentle manner belied his role as one of Africa's most influential technology advocates. The African Union has approved our proposal, he announced. The Continental Technology Sovereignty Initiative will receive $5 billion over the next 5 years to support community-owned technology companies across Africa. Dr. Hassan joined the meeting via video call from her medical network headquarters in Nairobi. Medical technology applications are exceeding all projections. Community-controlled pharmaceutical development, medical device manufacturing, telemedicine networks. We're building African solutions to African health challenges. Colonel Mwangi appeared on another screen from his Veteran Coordination Center in Kampala. Security and communications applications are proving equally successful. African governments are replacing European military contractors with community-developed alternatives. As the meeting continued, Amara marveled at how the networks that had saved her company had evolved into continental infrastructure for African technological independence. The invisible communication systems that Joseph had taught her to understand had become the foundation for new economic and political relationships across Africa. There's one more announcement, Pastor Kivuli said with evident pride. The United Nations Development Program has asked the African Community Technology Initiative to present our model at their next global conference. They want to explore replicating community ownership structures on other continents. Joseph laughed. From homeless network engineer to international development consultant, life has interesting turns. From nearly bankrupt entrepreneur to continental technology leader, Amara replied. I never imagined that losing everything would lead to building something so much bigger. As the meeting concluded and the various leaders signed off, Amara walked to her office window and looked down at the streets that had taught her everything about how information, trust, and community really worked in Africa. The same Matata drivers were navigating traffic. The same vendors were calling out their wares. The same complex networks of human relationships were coordinating the daily life of 7 million people. But now, instead of trying to replace those networks with technology, Swift Deliver worked with them, strengthened them, and learned from them. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, and for a moment, Amara felt a familiar chill of fear. But the message was different this time. Ms. Nyong'o, I'm David Chun, CEO of a technology company in Singapore. We've been studying your community ownership model and would like to discuss adapting it for Southeast Asian markets. Could we arrange a consultation? Similar messages have been arriving for months from technology entrepreneurs across the global South, Latin America, Asia, the Pacific Islands, all interested in learning how to build technology companies that serve communities instead of extracting wealth from them. Joseph appeared at her shoulder. Another consultation request? Singapore this time. That makes 43 countries that want to learn the African model. Morrison was right about one thing, he said with a grin. The Swift Deliver model isn't scalable using traditional corporate structures. It's scalable using something much more powerful. Human networks built on trust, respect, and shared prosperity. As the sun set over Dar es Salaam, Painting the Indian Ocean in brilliant oranges and reds, Amara reflected on everything that had changed since that first drone crashed into the wedding cake. She'd lost a traditional technology company, but gained something unprecedented, a new model for how technology could serve human flourishing instead of corporate profit. The homeless man who had taught her to listen to the city's 7 million voices had become her closest advisor and friend. The community networks she'd initially seen as obstacles to technological progress had become a foundation for African technological sovereignty. The woman who had threatened to destroy African innovation had accidentally catalyzed the largest community-controlled technology movement in human history. Most importantly, the drones that had once crashed because they couldn't hear the conversations of African communities now flew in harmony with human networks, strengthening relationships instead of replacing them, serving community needs instead of corporate shareholders. Amara's phone rang with a call from her sister in Kampala, excited to share news about a community-owned renewable energy company that was adopting Swift Deliver's organizational model. As they talked, Amara looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle across Dar es Salaam. Millions of people connected by invisible networks of trust, cooperation, and shared dreams. The future belonged to those who understood that technology's greatest power lay not in replacing human connections, but in strengthening them, and in learning to listen to the conversations that held the world together. As Amara prepared to leave the office that evening, she paused at her desk where a framed photograph showed her shaking hands with Mama Zubeda at the signing of Swift Deliver's Community Ownership Charter. Beside it lay a handwritten letter from a young girl in rural Kenya, thanking Swift Deliver for delivering textbooks to her school when no other company would serve a remote village. These reminders of why the struggle mattered gave her strength for the challenges ahead. Because despite Swift Deliver's success, despite the continental movement they'd sparked, despite Morrison's defeat and EuroTech's collapse, Amara knew the war for African technological independence was far from over. Other foreign corporations were already studying EuroTech's failures, developing more sophisticated strategies for controlling African markets. The next threats would be subtler, more patient, harder to detect and expose. But they would face a transformed continent. African communities that had discovered their collective power. Networks that had learned to coordinate across borders, languages, and cultures. Young entrepreneurs who understood that true innovation came from serving communities rather than extracting from them. Joseph appeared in her doorway one last time, ready to walk her to her car as he did every evening. A security precaution that had become a cherished ritual of friendship. One more message came in, he said, holding up his phone. This one's special. From where? From a group of homeless technology workers in Lagos, Johannesburg, and Cairo. They've been following our story, and they want to start their own community-owned technology cooperative. Amara smiled, remembering how this whole journey had begun with a homeless man who understood networks that billion-dollar algorithms couldn't see. What did you tell them? I told them what Mama Zubeda told us. The most powerful technologies are built by people who understand the communities they serve. And sometimes, the people who understand communities best are the ones who've lived closest to the ground. As they walked through the Innovation Center, passing engineers, community liaisons, and network coordinators preparing for another day of building African technological solutions, Amara felt the weight of responsibility and the lightness of hope in equal measure. The story that had begun with crashing drones and corporate threats had become something much larger. Proof that communities could control their own technological destinies when they work together. But every story needs its readers, every movement needs its participants, and every vision of the future needs people willing to build it. The question wasn't whether the model would spread. The question was who would have the courage to listen to their own communities, challenge existing power structures, and build technology that served human flourishing instead of corporate profit. If this story inspired you, don't let it end here. Every community has its own 7 languages, invisible networks of trust, knowledge, and cooperation that no algorithm can see, but human wisdom can unlock. Every entrepreneur faces the choice between serving shareholders or serving communities. Every society must decide whether technology will strengthen human connections or replace them. Take action. Listen to the networks in your own community that others ignore. Support locally owned businesses that prioritize community benefit. Question whether the technology you use serves your needs or someone else's profits. Connect with others who believe innovation should strengthen communities, not exploit them. Share this story with entrepreneurs, community leaders, and anyone who believes that technology's greatest power lies in bringing people together rather than driving them apart. The future belongs to those who learn to listen to conversations that hold the world together.